Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Joining us today for a deep dive into the regulatory morass of vaping in the United States is Azim Chowdhury from the firm Keller Heckman. Azim is a regulatory and public policy lawyer with a focus on food and drug law, and for over a decade, he's been one of the most prominent legal advocates for the U.S. vaping industry. Azim, thanks for coming back on RegWatch.
Glad to be here again.
It's been 2 years since we last had you on the show, and at the time, the so-called epidemic of teen vaping had yet to be declared, and the Valley Scare, which did so much damage to vaping, we couldn't even imagine that. And yet, back then already, the U.S. vaping industry was already under mortal threat from FDA's premarket tobacco application process. Fill our viewers in about PMTA. Just what is it?
It is the primary pathway to bringing a new e-cigarette or ENDS product to market. As you know, back in 2009, Congress passed the Tobacco Control Act, which gave FDA the authority to regulate tobacco products, which in this case are anything made or derived from tobacco, including components and parts. And so that definition was broad enough to capture ENDS products or vaping products following the FDA's 2016 deeming rule. But under the statute, all new products require pre-market authorization. And a new product is anything introduced or modified after the statutory grandfather date, which is going way back to February 2007. So for the case of vaping or e-cigarettes, that's basically the entire industry. There are no confirmed grandfathered e-cigarettes. And so all products currently on the market do require going through this pre-market process, going through the PMTA.
Now, what I find so interesting when you look back at the history of what's going on is that FDA had no authority over cigarettes. And so it was the Obama administration brought in their 2009 Act, which really, brought tobacco products under the FDA's guideline. But yet, this issue in terms of deeming e-cigarettes to be a tobacco product, there was that original NJOY lawsuit, which was filed that kind of did that to the industry already.
Right. So the NJOY lawsuit, Cetera case, that was sort of at the same time as the Tobacco Control Act becoming law. And this was, what happened was the NJOY and some other companies were the first to bring e-cigarettes to the U.S. market from China. These are the original cig-alike products. And what FDA's initial position on these products was that these must be drug delivery devices or drug products because they contain nicotine and they're being delivered into the body. And even though these products weren't being marketed for any therapeutic benefit or smoking cessation. And so Cetera, and which was NJOY, they challenged FDA once they received a warning letter from FDA to come off the market and said, well, hold on, we're not a drug. We are a tobacco product under this new law, which had just passed. And it was one of the first, if not the only decision at the time in 2010, the district court in DC, the appellate court, ultimately agreed with Cetera that e-cigarettes that contain tobacco-derived nicotine that are not marketed for a therapeutic purpose, that are recreational in nature, customarily marketed is the term, that those are in fact tobacco products and not drugs. But because of the way that the Tobacco Control Act was structured, it kind of created this gap, because the statute, as I mentioned earlier, while it defined tobacco product very broadly to include anything derived from tobacco, it only gave the FDA back in 2009 the immediate authority to regulate certain categories of tobacco products: cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, and roll your own tobacco. Anything else, Congress left it up to FDA to deem them to be regulated tobacco products. And so at the time of the Cetera decision, the court held that they are tobacco products, but they were not yet regulated until FDA promulgated its deeming rule, which didn't happen for a few years.
Yeah, and that was 2016, wasn't it?
Yep, the final rule was published on August 8th, 2016. It became effective that date. And from that point on, e-cigarettes or anything made or derived from tobacco were subject to the Tobacco Control Act requirements, including pre-market authorization, which, again, because of the way the law was structured, it still required e-cigarettes to be subject to the same grandfather date of 2007, even though they had just been deemed to be regulated in 2016.
Right, but of course, cigarettes didn't have to go through any of this.
That's right. Cigarettes and those traditional products, well, really any product that was on the market as of the grandfather date is still subject to the Tobacco Control Act, but in the case of pre-market authorization, they are grandfathered. So they aren't subject to going through PMTAs or even substantial equivalence reports, which is the primary other pathway to make changes to those products.
And now that 2007 date always seemed to feel like it was purposefully picked because it was the year, essentially, that e-cigarettes really made it into the U.S.
Well, I mean, I think it's a kind of a coincidence, really. My understanding is that that date, February 15th, 2007, was the date that the initial legislation was introduced that ultimately became the Tobacco Control Act by Senator Kennedy back in 2007, which was just before, I think, the first e-cigarettes, those Android products, were starting to come to market.
So let's jump forward a little bit because there were a lot of ups and downs. We had, Commissioner Gottlieb for a time there, extending the extension to 2022, then it moved to 2021, and then we had this very famous decision by Judge Grimm in a case regarding some public health groups. Why don't you fill us in on that? Because that was the last thing we had you on the show for. Following
the deeming rule, right? One of the things the deeming rule did is while it extended the pre-market authorization requirements to e-cigarettes, and it did not change the grandfather date, it did create a what they call a compliance period or a compliance policy that allowed products that were already on the market as of August 8th, 2016, to remain on the market without pre-market authorization until such time as the applications became due, in this case, the PMTA. That deadline is what has been fluctuating over the years, right? Initially, it was 2018 in the original deeming rule. As you mentioned, when Commissioner Gottlieb came into office, he, via guidance, extended that deadline to 2022, which really made sense for the industry because it takes years to develop the studies and data to support a PMTA. That deadline, that 2022 deadline, was challenged by the public health groups in 2019, who argued that FDA really couldn't change the date for the PMTA deadline via guidance. It had to go through a notice and comment rulemaking process under the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act. And ultimately, they prevailed. The tobacco control groups prevailed, and the federal judge in Maryland, even though he had established that the FDA should have gone through rulemaking, created their own compliance deadline initially of May 2020, which was 10 months from that original decision, and that was ultimately moved to September 9th, 2020, because of COVID.
So we hit September 9th, 2020, and so FDA, as we know, was flooded with applications. Give our viewers an understanding of just how many applications hit FDA.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, actually. I don't think anyone could have predicted what would actually happen come September. The agency, just by way of background, the agency had estimated somewhere between, I think, 5,000 and 6,000 total pre-market applications would be submitted. That includes PMTAs as well as substantial equivalence reports. And what ended up happening was applications covering over 6 million, I think 6.3 million products were submitted by the deadline. And now here we are. The vast majority of those applications have been accepted and filed by FDA. So quite a tremendous feat, I think, by the industry. And that was mostly driven by the smaller businesses, the e-liquid industry, vape shops that are the ones that have really thousands of products because of the different types of variations of their e-liquids.
So these thousands of products, millions of applications. Now let's just dig a little bit deeper into what it is exactly the approval is that they're seeking. So is this essentially a marketing approval? That means that if they get approved, they'll be allowed to sell their product. They'll be allowed to market their product. Is that right?
Right. So the term is actually authorization. FDA is very clear that they never approve of any tobacco product. No tobacco product is safe. But they do permit marketing authorization to allow a product to remain on the market. What does that mean? So to get a PMTA authorized or to get a product authorized through the PMTA process, an applicant needs to demonstrate that the product is appropriate for the protection of the public health. It's a very high standard. It's a new standard that FDA has never really had to deal with before, established by Congress in the TCA, which is arguably a higher standard than even for new drugs, which is safe and effectiveness. And that's because the public health standard for tobacco products requires assessing the impact on the overall population. How does it impact both users and non-users? How does it impact people who are non-smokers as well as smokers? Obviously, great emphasis on underage or youth use of these products, vulnerable populations. So companies have to be able to demonstrate the overall almost benefit of their product to the population.
Now that's interesting. And that was worrying at first. I know for a lot of people was that how could, a small company who's creating, an in-house e-juice, for instance, possibly be able to do the science and all the research to prove that their e-juice is appropriate for the protection of public health?
Yeah, and that is a concern that remains. First, you have to understand that the PMTAs that have been now accepted and that are on FDA's public PMTA list, those are not products that have yet been authorized officially through the process. FDA hasn't determined whether they have met the public health standard. That list and those products have so far gotten through the first, maybe the second stage, which is acceptance and filing. And so, the standards for getting an application accepted is much lower. It requires some basic information on the company, the product. It requires providing an environmental assessment, which is probably the most kind of tricky part of the application to get accepted. But companies, have been able to so far get through those hurdles, which is, again, huge success, especially for those small companies. Many of those applicants, particularly on the smaller side, likely did not have the time or the funding to complete scientifically rigorous PMTAs. They may not have had time or ability to submit analytical data, toxicology data, behavioral studies, perception studies, abuse liability, the things that ultimately may need to be required to get authorization. So there is a big question mark about what happens next. These small companies are still alive. They got through those first two stages, but now starts the scientific review.
Do they have the opportunity to add additional stuff to fill out the application, or is it only what was included in the first application?
No, I think FDA has indicated that companies are permitted to keep providing data. You can submit PMTA amendments as you are able to complete additional studies to support your product and the marketing of your product, particularly because of COVID. I think FDA, back in September of 2020, many companies reached out to FDA. Citizen petitions were filed suggesting that, or asking FDA to continue to extend the deadline because we were still in the middle of the pandemic, and it was really making it difficult for companies to get the testing done. Even shipping products to the labs who are all working, who were shut down, was almost impossible. And so FDA indicated that companies, as long as they got applications in on time by the deadline, would be allowed to continue to provide information as it comes in, particularly for things like stability data, which are things that just take time, and other longer term studies. So FDA has provided companies that option.
So with having 6 million products, applications being accepted, is there any advantage to the industry overall to have had so many applications submitted?
Well, is there an advantage to the industry? What it shows is that, the reason, again, we have so many applications is because these small businesses have so many products, and that's what really allows them to survive, is by having many different flavors and different nicotine levels, and to market a variety of products to their adult consumers. So companies, the vape shop model doesn't survive with just a handful of products, right? I mean, it survives because of the variety of e-liquids that are available, right, and devices that are available. That's how the small part of it, the vape shop model, survives. Certainly, I think having submitted that many applications, it helps these companies continue to do business, and it has given FDA a lot to chew on in the meantime.
It begs the question then, does FDA have the bandwidth and the capacity to process that many applications?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think FDA has done a great job so far. I mean, given what they were handed, right? They were stuck with the deadline as well, in a way. And they did create a system that allowed for the submission of these products, these applications, through the CTP portal, allowing companies to have applications delivered to the agency before the deadline. It was certainly a huge task for them to be able to sort these applications, many of which are hundreds of thousands of pages long, right? So you're dealing with a ton of data in a very short period of time. And overall, I think FDA has done a really good job of processing those applications, and giving companies hopefully a fair chance to stay on the market and provide additional data through amendments. And we hope to be able to respond to FDA's questions.
Now, and keeping this question still to the small businesses that have applied, what kind of chance do they have of actually getting through?
That's a great question. Again, a lot of these small businesses, they simply were unable to submit scientifically rigorous applications, right? If you compare what they likely submitted compared to what larger companies, big tobacco companies submitted, you're comparing apples and oranges, right? But on the other hand, you have companies that have, by and large, similar products. I mean, e-liquids are all virtually the same. You're talking about the same components, the same flavors, nicotine, etc. And a lot of them base their applications on published literature, trying to make an argument that based on what we know about these products, who's using them, particularly in the open system space, evidence that they are helping adult smokers transition away from much more harmful combustible cigarettes, along with data to support that, marketing data. post-market surveillance strategies. I mean, our hope is that despite the fact that these companies may not have had the ability to submit long-term behavioral studies, for example, that FDA will look at who they're marketing their products to, who's using their products, adult smokers, and consider that when reviewing their applications. And we'll have to see how it plays out.
For these smaller companies, have we heard yet whether or not has there been a culling from FDA? And let me partner that question with that there is another deadline coming up, which could impact this, correct?
Correct. FDA has certainly continued to enforce. We've seen FDA send around warning letters to companies that fail to meet the PMTA deadline. I think there have been dozens of warning letters at this point that have collectively covered hundreds of thousands of products that were not subject to timely submitted PMTAs, right? And so really those products should not be on the market. If you didn't submit a PMTA, you're not legally allowed to be on the market if you're a tobacco product. And so we have seen FDA certainly enforce on that end. With the publication of the PMTA list, right, I expect FDA will also continue to enforce against companies who didn't make that list, who maybe had late PMTAs, or it turns out their products weren't on the market back in August 2016. I do expect FDA to continue to enforce and bring those types of products off the market. In terms of the deadline, so as you mentioned, September 9th, going back to that federal court decision, when the judge established the September 2020 deadline, he also established what I call a sunset period. So FDA had until 1 year to review the applications submitted on time. And that year ends on September 9th, 2021. What the judge also did, though, was give FDA the authority to use its enforcement discretion to, on a case-by-case basis, continue to allow products to stay on the market that are subject to PMTAs after September 9th, 2021. And so again, FDA hasn't announced an official policy about what happens after that date. We're eagerly awaiting for FDA to do so. Our hope is that FDA will give the companies that have demonstrated in their PMTAs that they've made a good faith effort to go through this process, a chance to stay on the market and ultimately respond to FDA's deficiency questions. So that's our hope here.
So what do we know about the larger companies and the multi-million-dollar applications by Juul and Big Tobacco and Big Vape, some big vaping companies out there too as well? How certain is it that they are going to get authorization from FDA?
I don't think anything is certain when it comes to this. From what we know, what's been publicly available, companies like Juul have submitted very comprehensive PMTAs. They have done dozens of studies. They have been peer-reviewed. They've been published. They have provided FDA with a ton of scientific data and information to demonstrate that their products meet the public health standard. But Juul in particular, as you may have seen from the recent congressional hearing, is continuously attacked for its past behavior and its past marketing practices. And so there are many folks who are of the opinion that Juul, despite the data they've submitted to FDA, should never be granted a PMTA, right? Because of that history. So nothing I think is certain, but our hope again is that FDA is an agency based on science. It does regulate based on science. They will review the data, not just from Juul, but everyone else, and allow companies to prove that they are appropriate for the public health.
We just had Alex Norsh, journalist from Filter, on the show, and I was actually kind of surprised about, a glimmer of optimism that he had. He had said in the show that it's pretty likely that at least a couple of companies are going to get authorized by FDA, and then once that happens, there's the potential then that there'll be some good news stories, some positive messaging. If, indeed, some of these larger companies do get authorization, could that lead to a change in public perception?
Well, I think it's still, I'm probably a little less optimistic than Alex. Certainly, I think if the FDA can review the science and authorize a product for marketing, which therefore means it is appropriate for the protection of public health, I think that would be huge. Right? I think we've seen that. The FDA has authorized other types of tobacco products, smokeless tobacco, the IQOS heated tobacco product. They have been authorized, but will it lead to a kind of shifting of the public perception? I don't know. You have now, public health groups that seem to be arguing that maybe FDA's scientific review shouldn't be all that matters. That at the state level at least, states and local jurisdictions should continue to ban products and ban flavors. Whereas I believe that FDA is the entity that has access to all of the information and data and science and is in the best position to determine whether a product is appropriate for the public health.
Well, if there's one thing that's clear, and we've seen that operating up in Canada here, is that these nonprofit, unelected public health groups have an inordinate amount of ability to pressure regulators into doing something. I mean, Health Canada has been under a massive amount of pressure. Otherwise, they wouldn't have reversed the legalization of vaping, essentially, that they did in 2018.
That's the reality that we live in, right? And there are going to be certain entities that are never going to see the potential benefit of these products for adults. And again, everyone can agree youth use of these products is we don't want. No one wants kids to use these products. But again, when it comes to Health Canada or FDA, I continue to hope that the legislators would allow those agencies, in the case of the FDA, the agency that Congress gave the authority to determine whether something is appropriate for the protection of the public health. Let them do their job. Let them do their job. And if a product, even a flavored product, can meet that standard, then we should trust the science.
Azim, we had a representative from SFATA on earlier this year to talk about what happens after a product receives marketing authorization, and a program they have called the Responsible Industry Network. Do you know anything about RIN, and does something like that have any legs?
No, I think it's a great idea. I think it's something that the industry, I wish, had adopted years ago, because it's a way of ensuring that products are distributed properly in compliance with all of the applicable laws, that youth access is controlled and prevented, that the companies that are retailing these products and manufacturing them are all working together to ensure compliance. A big part of the PMTA, I think, especially for the smaller companies, if they have any chance of getting through the PMTA process, it's going to be because of their rigid compliance to marketing and post-market surveillance. It's going to be because they can show that their products are truly being used by adult smokers, that they are in a controlled distribution network. It's not getting out. It's not getting, youth are not getting access to those products. Everyone is age verified. That would be the only real way, I think, for FDA to have any confidence that products that may not be subject to all of the expensive long-term studies are still appropriate for the protection of the public health.
So then, it makes sense to me, because post-market reporting, this isn't just an authorization issue and then it's done. It's really the monitoring after that you're talking about, and that's critical. Now, so what I was trying to get at with the folks from Svana during that episode on RIN was how much value actually could a program like that have in helping convince the FDA to approve to authorize some of the PMTAs for some of the smaller companies. Did I hear that right from you, that it might actually play a role?
I think so. I think, if you're a small business and you submit a PMTA, if you don't have the type of scientific data that FDA is seeing from bigger players, right? Your best shot is to show FDA that you are controlling who is buying your products, how it's being marketed, that it is not getting into the hands of youth. That's what's going to differentiate this industry, the smaller industry, the RIN industry, from the larger players that are primarily sold in convenience stores, in gas stations and grocery stores. Those nationwide type mass marketed products, I guess there's an argument that those products, because of their larger impact on the overall population or potential impact, because they are sold in those types of brick and mortar stores, that perhaps they should be subject to more scientifically rigorous demonstration to meet the public health standard. Whereas smaller companies, vape shop model, again, which is focused on adult sales, they can still demonstrate that they meet the standard, I think, by showing FDA that their products are being used by their target audience.
A big part of the problem are politicians and anti-vaping advocacy groups pushing for flavor bans. They've made huge headway in numerous states. Certain members of Congress have even attempted to get FDA commissioner to promise or guarantee that FDA would not authorize any flavored products through PMTA process. Azim, can the commissioner even do that?
I think the commissioner made clear at the recent congressional hearing that FDA has to go through its procedures. There's a very clear pathway to market established by Congress through the premarket authorization pathway. And FDA is obligated to review all of the data that it is presented by the applicant and whatever it can find on its own, frankly. So FDA, I don't think the commissioner certainly is not going to be in a position to be able to just say that all flavor products are not going to meet the standard. FDA has to go through that on a case-by-case, application-by-application basis. In fact, I get the question a lot about, can FDA just ban flavors the way they did in pod systems a couple of years ago? And really, at this point, in a post-PMTA submission world, the only way FDA would be able to do any kind of product standard to ban flavors would be through notice and comment rulemaking. And that's a process that takes years. It's going to take years for FDA to complete the rulemaking process for menthol cigarettes, which they recently announced they would pursue, as well as banning flavored cigars. It's going to be years before that actually happens because of just the nature of the rulemaking process.
Now, could that actually lead to a flavor ban, I guess, is the question.
Right. I don't, in the case of ENDS products, I don't see FDA at this point attempting to extend the flavor ban, the menthol ban or cigar ban to flavored ENDS through the proposed rulemaking process. I think that would just complicate things for them. It would lead to probably a few 100,000 more comments they have to review and respond to, and probably lead to more potential litigation down the road if that rule becomes final. What's much more likely to happen is that FDA is just going to continue through the PMTA process and decide on a case-by-case basis whether a flavored product meets the standard. And it may end up being that many flavored products don't meet the standard according to FDA and ultimately get taken off the market. But that's the way FDA is going to proceed rather than rulemaking. Now, of course, there's also the possibility that Congress could pass legislation banning flavors, right? But from a strictly FDA point of view, I think they're just going to keep moving ahead with the PMTA process.
Azim, an interesting question I have for you is regarding synthetic nicotine, because if everything comes down to being deemed a tobacco product, it's nicotine derived from tobacco, what happens if the nicotine is no longer derived from tobacco?
We're seeing that question come up a lot as companies look for ways to continue to market products. As you mentioned, the tobacco definition is based on whether the product is made or derived from tobacco. And arguably, if an e-liquid or an e-cigarette device does not contain any tobacco-derived ingredients, if it is purely synthetic nicotine, then, and nothing else, no tobacco extracts or anything like that, then it wouldn't fall under the definition of a tobacco product, right? I guess it depends on the type of device, because there is this broader definition of components and parts. And if FDA can determine that even a synthetic product or a zero nicotine product is intended or reasonably expected to be used with a tobacco product, then it could fall under the components and parts definition and become a tobacco product. But if you're dealing with a device, a disposable even, that is not being refilled or manipulated by the user, and it doesn't contain anything derived from tobacco, then it's really not a tobacco product and wouldn't be subject to the PMTA process or the deeming rule, for example. It does beg the question, though, of does FDA have other authority that could capture those products? And that's kind of a gray area. I think there's an argument that FDA does have authority to regulate those products as drugs or drug delivery devices. Going back to how FDA took the position with the original e-cigarettes in the Cetera case, right, that led to the NJOY lawsuit back in 2008. FDA's position back then was that the nicotine was a drug delivery product, even though it didn't have any therapeutic claims associated with the product, with the e-cigarette. And FDA lost that case because the court held it was tobacco-derived nicotine, right? And therefore it was a tobacco product. Now, if you take away the fact that it's tobacco-derived, if you're going back to non-tobacco world, then does FDA go back to square one and say, okay, well, now we're back to a drug delivery device? But again, the absence of therapeutic claims, is it intended to help people quit smoking or not? Or they're making claims to that effect, I think is going to be a big question as to how they're regulated. But that's sort of kind of the gray area we're in now, and I expect the FDA at some point will take a position.
Now, Congress keeps chipping away at certain things, of course. They did make the Pact Act happen. And, that's the vape mail ban. Why don't you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, no, that's also been a huge deal for the industry recently. So the Pact Act is the Prevent All Cigarette Trafficking Act, and it's been around actually since 2010, right around the same time that the Tobacco Control Act became law. And back then, its subject products were cigarettes and smokeless tobacco, not vaping products. And the purpose of the Pact Act was really to ensure that the non-compliant products in terms of registrations with the ATF, Pact licensing, and taxes were all in order. And as you mentioned, the vape mail ban, in addition to compliance requirements for shippers of those products, the Pact Act prohibited the delivery using the Postal Service of products to consumers. And that was something that initially, again, it applied to cigarettes. And at the end of 2020, with the Trump administration amended the law, that Pact Act was extended to include ENDS products. And that definition of ENDS is actually very broad, and it includes things, not just nicotine products or nicotine delivery products, but really anything that's inhaled or vaped. So any kind of vaping product, whether it's CBD or non-nicotine, is now subject to that act.
What exactly is going on down there? Like, I mean, if you're a regular consumer in the U.S., let's just say you're in Texas, are you able to order e-juice from Oregon?
Yeah, the landscape has changed, I think, a lot in the last few months. And for the online retailers that were making it possible for that type of transaction to happen for a consumer, it's become much more difficult. So the Pact compliance requirements, state registrations, ATF registration, licensing, those all went into effect at the end of March. Okay, the mail ban, the ban on the use of the postal service to deliver products to consumers, that was supposed to go into effect at the end of April. The statute gave the postal service 120 days to promulgate rulemaking. However, the postal service has been delayed, and we haven't seen that final rule come out yet, although it could come out at any time now. But so the mail is still kind of operational, so to speak. But I think you're seeing a lot of, to go back to your question, I think you're seeing a lot of online retailers have gone out of business in the last few months because the burden of compliance with the Pact Act, all those registrations and licensing, have been very difficult for small companies, and online retailers have taken the biggest hit. So on top of that, while the Pact Act is only able to ban the use of the mail, we've seen the common carriers like Federal Express, UPS, and others take the position that they were no longer going to deliver vape products, whether to consumers or to businesses, and that's had a huge impact as well.
Yeah, that's difficult. Now, for distributors and stuff like that, they're still able to get product out to retailers, are they not?
If they're able to comply with the compliance requirements and find shippers that are able to make those deliveries, freights, for example, we're seeing that part of the industry is surviving, but the cost of compliance remains very high.
Right. What about the threat of new taxes?
That's always a threat. I think at the state level, we're at 28 or 29 states that have some form of a vape-related excise tax, and there are new laws being passed all the time. At the federal level, there was a bill proposed that would tax vaping products. I think it's still in the early stages, but that would tie the vape. It would create a vape tax or an e-cig tax, a federal e-cigarette tax, online or on par with the cigarette tax. So again, that's not yet become law. Brett, where we're headed is once there are products that make it through the PMTA process, and FDA has the ability to understand their true market size and volume of sales. Right now, it's very difficult, I think, to really know because there's just so many products, so many companies. I think you will see that those products that survive the PMTA will be subject to user fees. FDA will have to figure out how to calculate those fees based on their market share, and they will be subject to taxes at the state and federal level, right? I mean, I think that's where it's headed, where there's a handful of companies with a handful of products that are authorized by FDA. They're subject to post-marketing restrictions and surveillance, and they're subject to taxes and user fees.
So that's some good news, would be that there would be at least some product out there available for consumers. Yeah,
I mean, I think ultimately we will see some products. Certainly tobacco-flavored products probably have a leg up in this environment. I think it's, again, hopefully the companies that are subject to this process can provide FDA with enough support for their flavored products to also get through. I think that's really the biggest question.
You work with a lot of companies, you have for a long time in this industry. How do they feel about the future?
There's a lot of uncertainty, right? These are businesses that, for the most part, are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to keep their employees employed. They're trying to put food on the table for their families, and they're trying to help smokers, right? And there's a lot of uncertainty. Really, we don't know what's going to happen in just a few months. Is FDA going to pull the rug out from under us and say you can't market products until after the PMTAs are processed or reviewed, which could take years? Are they going to have to shut down because of that? Are they going to end up not being able to afford to comply with all of the Pact requirements? Are they going to be slowly killed by all the state flavor bans, right, or excise taxes? And so I think there is a recognition, writing on the wall, that companies are slowly coming to grips with, that it's going to be difficult to be in this forever. And at the beginning of this conversation, it had been 2 years, right, since our last interview. If you told me 2 years ago, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, which you might have to go back and look, but if you'd asked me if we would still be here 2 years from then, I would have said, hey, it's 50-50, given the flavor situation, given the Valley Scare, the youth epidemic, the way things were looking for a while. It didn't look good, right? But here we are 2 years later. So I try to remind my clients of that things may look bleak now, but no one thought you could submit PMTAs. No one thought you'd get this far in the process. No one thought we'd figure out ways to comply with Pact Act or get products delivered. But companies are still surviving. They're still fighting to the end to keep their products on the market for adults. And while it still looks bleak, and I can't predict what happens in 2 more years, our hope is that, things get better and that FDA that makes the right decisions and recognizes, not just FDA, but legislators and public health, recognize that there is huge potential benefit for these products for adults and not just tobacco flavors. So I try to keep my clients positive in that sense.
Fingers crossed.
Indeed.